You wake up next to someone you thought you loved. The person who once made your heart race now makes your stomach turn. And the worst part? It's not because love died, it's because the bills came. Saint Teresa of Avila saw this pattern repeat itself hundreds of times across 16th century Spain. She watched marriages crumble, she witnessed friendships shatter, she saw families torn apart, not by infidelity, not by violence, but by something far more insidious, money. And what she saw terrified her more than any vision of hell ever could. Her father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, was a wealthy wool merchant, one of the richest men in Avila. Her mother, Beatriz d'Avila y Ahumada, came from two of the city's leading families. Teresa knew what prosperity looked like. She also knew what it cost. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from the collected works of Saint Teresa of Avila, translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez, published by ICS Publications, the definitive scholarly edition of her complete writings, including the Book of Her Life, The Interior Castle, The Way of Perfection, and the Book of Foundations, works that contain her direct observations, and spiritual testimonies documented between 1560 and 1582. Now back to the information. What did they fight about? What destroyed their peace? The nuns weren't immune. In fact, they were worse, because they'd taken vows of poverty while clinging to their possessions like drowning people clutch driftwood. 16th century Spain was brutal for women. Many men had left for the New World or died in Spain's endless wars. Women had limited options. Marry beneath your station, stay home and be a burden, or enter a convent where you could at least maintain some dignity. They entertained visitors in the parlor. They wore jewelry. They arranged their veils attractively. They had servants. Room assignments weren't based on spiritual merit. They were based on social status. Wealthier nuns got better rooms. Rooms could be bought and sold. Let that sink in. Inside a house dedicated to poverty and prayer, real estate transactions were happening. Part of her wanted God. Part of her wanted the world. She was charming. Everyone liked her, and she liked being liked. The convent encouraged her to entertain important visitors because their gifts helped the community's economy. So Teresa would sit in the parlor, charming nobility, telling stories, laughing at jokes, all while her soul withered. She saw nuns who'd entered with genuine devotion, slowly poisoned by comparison and competition. Who had more visitors? Whose family sent better gifts? Who could afford nicer things? The vows meant nothing. The spiritual life was a performance, and underneath it all, grinding everyone down to dust, was the constant anxiety about money. In 1538, she suffered an illness so severe she fell into a coma for 4 days. Some accounts say it was malaria. Others suggest it was psychosomatic, her body collapsing under the weight of inner division. She was paralyzed for 3 years. The physical pain was unbearable, but during those 3 years of suffering, something shifted. When you can't move, you have to think. When you can't escape, you have to face yourself. She began to notice something about the people who visited her. The ones who truly cared came empty-handed and stayed. The ones who brought gifts usually left quickly. It was a show of concern, not actual concern. And the families, oh, the families. Teresa watched how illness could bankrupt a household, how medical treatments could turn loved ones into bitter creditors, how the sick became burdens measured in coin. Around 1554, at age 39, Teresa experienced her conversion. She knelt before a statue of Christ, the ex homo, showing Jesus humiliated and beaten, and something broke open inside her. She saw clearly for the first time that her divided life was killing her. She couldn't serve two masters, God or gold, peace or prestige, love or luxury. Choose. Once Teresa committed fully to the spiritual path, she began to see the machinery of attachment more clearly. It wasn't just her, it was everywhere. She started to understand that the greatest enemy of human peace wasn't evil, it was attachment to comfort, attachment to security, attachment to the illusion that more money would solve the problem that money had created, and not the gentle, comforting kind. In 1559, Teresa had a vision of Christ that would haunt her forever. He appeared not as a loving friend, but as a stern judge. She'd been spending time with a worldly woman, slipping back into old patterns of gossip and vanity. Christ's face was severe, his message clear. You cannot serve two masters. That vision terrified her more than any demon ever would. Because Teresa understood something most people miss. The devil doesn't need to drag you to hell. You'll walk there yourself, one comfortable compromise at a time, paved with reasonable excuses about providing for your family and maintaining your lifestyle. Inheritances, business failures, the relentless grind of trying to maintain appearances in a society that measured your worth by your possessions. Nobody blames their attachment. Nobody questions whether the life they're killing themselves to maintain is worth having in the first place. She'd seen men and women sacrifice everything good in their lives, every kind impulse, every generous thought, on the altar of economic anxiety. From good people who'd built their identities on their current arrangements. The nuns would do their own cooking, cleaning, sewing, everything. What does it say about the parents pressuring their daughters into loveless marriages for financial advantage? You're going to fail and humiliate us all. They depended on God and the charity of others. Therefore they had no one to resent. They did menial labor with their own hands. Therefore they understood the dignity of work. And without servants, without visitors, without the constant performance of social status, they discovered something revolutionary. They liked each other. Because if 13 poor women in sandals could be happier than wealthy nobles in their mansions, then the entire social order was built on sand. Unscrupulous businessmen, endless bureaucratic red tape. The Book of Foundations, which she wrote during this period, documents it all. Not spiritual flights, practical problems, contracts, property disputes, money. Every dispute over property revealed another layer of attachment. Every businessman who tried to cheat her showed her exactly how the worship of money destroys integrity. The friend who turns into an enemy over a small debt. The family member who stops speaking to you over an inheritance. The spouse who keeps separate accounts and views every purchase as a threat. How the fear of poverty drives people to commit acts they'd have called evil in others. These couples existed. Teresa knew them. They were rare, but they existed. And what distinguished them wasn't intelligence or willpower or even particularly deep faith. What distinguished them was a single decision, made once and then defended every day afterward. The decision to draw a line and say, beyond this line, we will not go, no matter what we might gain. Not self-hatred or grim joylessness, but the terrifying freedom that comes from saying, I don't need that, so you can't control me with it. You can't enter even the first mansion if you're carrying too much baggage. If your hands are full of possessions, your heart full of anxiety about losing them, the door won't open. Not because God's locked you out, but because you physically cannot fit through while clutching all that stuff. Bolt shut with their own hands. Let go. Just let go. But they couldn't. Because letting go meant facing the terror of having less, of being less, of appearing weak or foolish or unsuccessful. Every financial decision becomes a battleground. Every purchase becomes evidence of character flaws. Every disagreement about spending priorities becomes a referendum on the relationship itself. Because the anxiety isn't about money, it's about attachment to money. And that's a spiritual problem, not an economic one. That question destroyed people because they couldn't answer it honestly without admitting something terrible about themselves. They'd rather be right than be married. They'd rather win the argument than keep the relationship. They'd rather prove their point than preserve peace. And underneath all of it, the unspoken terror that if they gave an inch, if they compromised, if they admitted they might be wrong, everything would fall apart. Teresa saw this pattern so often she could predict it. A couple starts out in love, they marry, life happens, children arrive, expenses increase, one spouse spends more than the other thinks is reasonable, or one spouse earns less than the other thinks is acceptable. Arguments start small, they escalate. Soon they're not even arguing about the specific purchase or expense, they're arguing about everything. The money becomes a proxy for every disappointment, every unmet expectation, every way the other person has failed to be who you imagined they'd be. It makes you believe that if you just had a little more, or if your spouse would just stop being so unreasonable about spending, then everything would be fine. She'd watched people with massive fortunes agonize over tiny sums. She'd seen rich families destroy themselves over inheritances. She'd observed how often the people with the most resources were the most anxious, the most suspicious, the most miserable. It's not just poverty that destroys people. It's the constant worry about poverty, the obsessive checking of accounts, the midnight calculations, the endless mental gymnastics of trying to figure out how to afford things you don't actually need but feel you must have to maintain appearances. Priests who started out genuinely wanting to serve God but slowly, imperceptibly, got caught in the trap of needing wealthy patrons. And so they compromised. They told people what they wanted to hear instead of what they needed to hear. They avoided hard truths that might cost them donations. And year by year, their ministry became a business, their calling became a career, their vocation became a transaction. Teresa counseled women whose husbands had started out kind but grew cruel as financial pressure mounted. She talked to men whose wives had been generous but became miserly when resources tightened. She watched love curdle into contempt, intimacy decay into isolation, all because neither person could admit they were serving the wrong master. In 16th century Spain, as in every century before and since, everyone agreed that financial responsibility was a virtue. You should provide for your family, you should be prudent with money, you should plan for the future. All true, all reasonable, all used as cover for the kind of grasping, anxious, relationship-destroying attachment that Teresa saw as spiritual death. She wrote in the Book of Foundations about dealing with disputes over property for new convents. The fights were never really about the property. They were about control, about pride, about the fear of being taken advantage of. She'd enter a town to found a new house, and immediately people who'd seemed friendly turned hostile. Why? Because a new religious house meant competition for alms, and that meant less money for existing institutions, and that meant someone might have to get by with less. And that threat triggered a kind of primal panic in people who'd built their entire identities on maintaining their current level of comfort. You're afraid. Tell me what you're really afraid of. And once they named the fear, once they admitted it out loud, its power diminished. Altar of economic survival. Because if Teresa was right, then they'd wasted years destroying their marriages over things that didn't matter. I'm telling you that your anxiety about money is making you cruel to the people you love, and that cruelty is worse than any poverty you're trying to avoid. In 1575, Teresa founded a convent in Seville in Andalusia. The heat was unbearable, the poverty extreme, the opposition fierce, but she persisted, and what she saw there confirmed everything she'd learned. The poorest people were often the most generous, the wealthiest were often the most miserly, and the people who were the most anxious about money were usually the ones who had the most of it. She described one wealthy patron who'd promised a large donation, then pulled out over a tiny disagreement. Not because the money mattered to him, because he couldn't stand the idea that someone might take advantage of him. His fear of being cheated cost him the opportunity to do genuine good. And Teresa watched him walk away, his face twisted with resentment, and she understood. He didn't actually want to give. He wanted to be seen as generous while maintaining complete control. And the moment that control was threatened, even slightly, the whole charade collapsed. But because she'd already lost everything that attachment protects. Her husband was dead, her children grown. She had no reputation to maintain, no status to defend. She was free, and that freedom allowed her to love without calculation. Have. In her final years, she reflected on what she'd learned. And the theme that kept emerging was how attachment to material security destroys everything it touches. Marriages, friendships, families, communities, even the church. The moment people start making decisions based primarily on financial considerations, they've already lost something irreplaceable. They just don't know it yet. Teresa died on October 4th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes. She was 67. Her last words were about how grateful she was to die as a daughter of the church, but the legacy she left was more practical than mystical. She'd shown, by her life and her writings, that human happiness doesn't require what everyone thinks it requires. That peace is possible, even in poverty. That love survives when attachment dies. The question she left for every generation since is brutally simple. What are you willing to sacrifice for security? Is it worth your marriage, your children's respect, your own self-respect? Because whatever you choose to serve, that's your real God. And gods demand sacrifice. The God of financial security demands you sacrifice relationships, peace, sleep, health, and ultimately, the very security you're chasing. Teresa watched this tragedy play out hundreds of times. She tried to warn people. Most didn't listen. They couldn't. Because listening would mean changing, and changing would mean admitting they'd been wrong. And admitting they'd been wrong would mean facing the damage they'd done to people they loved while serving a God that never loved them back. We need to choose differently. Some chose poverty together rather than prosperity apart. Some decided that having less money and more peace was a trade worth making. And Teresa documented every one of these small victories because she understood that these decisions, repeated across thousands of households, were more powerful than any mystical vision. These were everyday people choosing love over fear, choosing trust over control, choosing enough over always wanting more. And the people you're doing this for, they don't need your anxiety. They need your presence, your attention, your peace. That the person next to you deserves better than the version of you that's consumed by financial dread. But she also believed some people could. She'd seen it, she'd lived it, and she documented it for anyone brave enough to try. In the moment when you choose truth over advantage. Teresa never married, never had children, never managed a household budget, but she understood the dynamics better than most people who lived them, because she'd spent decades listening to people's confessions, reading their letters, observing their choices, and she'd seen clearly what most people can't see from inside their own lives. The pattern, the poison, the way attachment slowly strangles love. Her final gift to us isn't a mystical teaching, it's a warning. And maybe, if you're lucky, a way out. The warning is this: you can lose everything that matters while protecting things that don't. You can sacrifice your marriage to save your mortgage. You can destroy your family to maintain your lifestyle. You can spend your entire life accumulating security and die completely alone. Admit what you're attached to. Name it out loud. Look at what you're actually serving, and then make a different choice. Not once. Every day. Every time the fear rises. Every time the anxiety whispers that you don't have enough, you're not doing enough, you need to protect yourself better. Choose presence over preparation for a future that might never come. In 1581, the year before she died, Teresa wrote a letter to a married couple she'd been directing. They'd been fighting about money for years, vicious fights, the kind that leave scars. They'd come to her separately, each convinced the other was the problem. She'd listened to both, and then she told them what she'd told hundreds of others. You're both wrong. The problem isn't who spends what. The problem is that you've both forgotten why you married each other in the first place. Every expense became evidence of poor character. Every financial disagreement became a battle for control. And now you hate each other, not because either of you is evil, but because you're both serving the wrong God. but that what you have right now in this moment is enough, and that your marriage is worth protecting even if it costs you financially. The way you can share a bed with someone and still be completely alone. 3 months before her death, Teresa received a letter from a young woman about to be married. The woman asked for advice. Teresa's response was found in her belongings after she died. It said this: "Remember that your husband is not your security. God is your security. The moment you start depending on him to make you feel safe financially, you will start resenting everything he does that threatens that feeling, and he will feel that resentment. And he will pull away, and you will panic, and the spiral will accelerate. Unless you decide now, before you marry, that you are secure in God alone. Not in your husband's earnings, not in your combined assets, in God. Make that decision now, or you will spend your marriage being a creditor instead of a wife." But because it was true, and everyone who read it recognized something they'd seen in their own families. The way money destroys trust, the way financial anxiety poisons intimacy, the way attachment to security costs you the very relationships that make life worth securing. But here's what's interesting. The miracles that persisted, the ones that got documented, weren't physical healings. They were relationship healings. Couples who'd been separated for years, reconciling. Families torn apart by inheritance disputes, making peace. Business partners who'd sued each other, finding forgiveness. But what they received, according to testimonies collected for her canonization process, was something else. Clarity, the ability to see what mattered, the courage to let go of what didn't, the freedom that comes from finally admitting that no amount of money will ever be enough to calm the fear that drives you to pursue it. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a Doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive that title. Her writings became required reading for anyone studying Catholic spirituality. But the specific observations she made about money and relationships never became popular, because they were too uncomfortable. They still are. A soil analysis of the properties her Reformed convents owned shows they were consistently the poorest land in their regions. Her nuns did their own labor, confirmed by municipal records showing no servant wages paid from those houses. Letters between her spiritual directees document the specific financial conflicts she mediated, down to the exact amounts disputed. Legal records from Toledo and Salamanca preserve her involvement in multiple lawsuits over convent properties, showing both her persistence and her eventual success in defending principles over profit. After 67 years of life, 30 years of managing convents, 20 years of founding institutions across Spain, she died owning exactly what she'd advocated everyone else let go of: nothing. And according to the nuns who witnessed her death, she was smiling.